Okay, class. So we're combining two sections into one here. The first, section 3 is multiplying polynomials. How do you multiply when you have either two binomials being multiplied by one another or just two polynomials? And so we'll kind of go through this first method, which is we're just using the distributive property. And what that means is in my first group here, I'm going to distribute each of these terms into the second group. And so to do that, I'm going to kind of cover this guy just temporarily. And I'm just going to distribute this first term, 2x, into this second group. And so 2x times x gives me 2x squared. 2x times 5 gives me 10x. So that's what happens when I distribute. Now I'm going to cover the 2x and I'm going to uncover the positive 3. So when I do that, I have to distribute this positive 3 into the second group, and so I get 3 times x, which is 3x, and I get 3 times 5, which is 15. And then what you can do to simplify is combine any like terms, and so my final answer becomes 2x squared, 2x squared plus 13x plus 15. So that is what happens when I use the distributive property. So why don't you try letter B and use the distributive property for this, and then check your answers in a little bit. So once you check your answers, I distributed both of them. Make sure you distribute this -2 instead of a +2. That minus sign acts as a negative sign. Now that's one of the methods of using the distributive property, and that's actually going to be handy on the second page. If you scroll down a little bit, we're going to see something called the FOIL method. Now FOIL can only be used for two binomials being multiplied by one another. It says right here, only multiplying two binomials. And so what FOIL stands for is the F stands for first, outer, inner, last terms. Now what that means, and I'm just going to kind of jump down to example 2 here. I'm going to multiply my first terms together, and that's just 2y times 3y to get 6y squared. And then I'm going to multiply my outer. My outer terms are 2y times 5, and so that becomes a 10y. And then I'm going to multiply my inner. And the inside two terms are -7 times 3y, and so that gives me a -21y. And then I'm going to multiply my last terms of each group. And the last terms are -7 times a +5, and so that gives me a -35. And then again, I'm going to combine any like terms, and actually this should be a +10y. And I'm going to tell you this, that my outer and inner terms will always be like terms. Always. And so I will get a 6y squared minus 11y minus 35. And so that's kind of the FOIL method of how to multiply binomials. Why don't you use the FOIL method for part B and then check your answers in a little bit. There's my simplified version. After I multiply using the FOIL method, again, the outer and inner were like terms, so I combined them to become just one term. So that's kind of the FOIL method. Again, can only be used when you're multiplying two binomials. You cannot use it for anything greater than two binomials or anything less than two binomials. So let's turn to the next page, and we're actually going to go to the distributive property again for the next page. Now we're multiplying one binomial times a trinomial. And so you can't use FOIL here. You're going to just have to use the distributive properties. And so what I'm going to do, I'm just going to again cover up the +5, and then I'm going to multiply the 6 into all three of these and see what I get. There's what I get for my multiplication. Again, make sure that x times x squared gives you an x cubed because you're adding the exponents together. And then so once I have all three terms, I'm going to erase the +5 and cover the 6x. And I'm going to multiply that out, and I'm actually going to do a little bit of a vertical thing just so that I line up my correct terms together. So 5 times 2x squared gives me a 10x squared, 5 times a negative 3x gives me a negative 15x, and then 5 times negative 5 gives me a negative 25. And so you'll see that it kind of lines up so that when we have to combine these terms, it's actually a lot easier. There's no other x cubed, so I can just bring this 12x cubed straight down. Negative 18x squared matches up with a positive 10x squared. That gives me a negative 8x squared. Negative 30x and a minus 15x gives me a negative 45x, and then there's nothing else besides this negative 25. And so my simplified version is 12x cubed minus 8x squared minus 45x minus 25. Why don't you try B, which is multiplying a trinomial times another trinomial? Okay, and then take a few minutes to try it and see what you end up with, and then I'll show you the answers in a little bit. So take a minute just to make sure that all of your terms here, after you've multiplied it, are correct. I've lined them up kind of neatly here so that I have all my like terms going up and down. Now, if they are correct, then you could just add straight up and down. So 6y to the fourth gives me a 6y to the fourth. Negative 10y cubed plus a 9y cubed gives me a negative y cubed, or negative 1y cubed. A positive 4y squared minus a 15y squared minus a 3y squared gives me a negative 14y squared. And then a positive 6y times a positive 5y gives me an 11y minus 2. And so this is my simplified version of when I multiply these two trinomials. We are now looking at the bottom word problem, example 4, where you have a swimming pool which is 15 feet by 20 feet, and then there's a deck around this swimming pool. Now, we don't know the distance between the swimming pool and the end of the deck. It's x. But we know that it's all the same side. And the question says, write an expression for the total area of the pool and the deck. So they want including the deck. Now, this might be a little bit tricky, but to find how long this is, we know that there is a little bit of an x right here, which also means there's an x right here. And so that means that it is 2 x's plus the original 20 feet that we had. And then the width is kind of the same idea. There's an x here, and this distance down below is also x, so the distance from here to here is 2 x's again plus the 15 that we already had. And so that actually kind of works out nicely because we know that the area formula for a rectangle is length times width. And so my length is 2x plus 20 times the width 2x plus 15. So there's my problem, and actually since it's two binomials, you can use the FOIL method. So why don't you go ahead, take a minute, and figure out this expression once you simplify it. We end up with that simplified expression after we multiply using FOIL. So that's actually section 3. Now section 4 is very, very similar. It's actually the same thing, only there are some shortcuts when you have some specific situations. So let's turn to the next page, and this is actually where there's going to be a little bit of a homework assignment. Now I'll go through this first rule with you. So there are 3 rules. 3 specific situations, okay? And after that, I'm going to kind of have you figure out what the last 2 rules are. Now, these are shortcuts. If you don't get these shortcuts right away, that's totally fine. You could just use the FOIL method, okay? So in example 1, it says square of a sum. And so each of these, what you'll notice is that you have the quantity x plus 3 squared. Now, I'm going to show in red what is incorrect. What people will want to do is distribute this 2, and they will think x squared plus 3 squared, which is 9, so this answer is x squared plus 9. That is not the correct answer, okay? Because when you really think about, and I'll do the correct way in blue, when you really think about what x plus 3 squared means, it means x plus 3 is being multiplied by itself 2 times. And so really what you have here is a FOIL problem. Because when you do the first, you get x squared. When you do the outer, you get 3x. When you do the inner, you get another 3x. When you do the last, you get a 9. So my simplified is x squared plus 6x plus 9. That's my simplified version, okay? So what I want you to do is numbers 2 and 3, I want you to FOIL them, and then I want you to see if you can observe any kind of pattern. What is the shortcut when you have a quantity squared, okay? So take a few minutes, find these two answers as you FOIL them, and then check your answers. When you FOIL them, for number 2, you get 9x squared plus 30x plus 25. For number 3, you get 9x squared plus 24x plus 16y squared. Number 3 could have been a little bit confusing for some people because there were 2 variables. You kind of do the same thing. Y times y gives you a y squared. Now, do you notice any kind of pattern? Any kind of shortcut? So on the bottom here it says rule for the square of a sum. When you have some number a plus some number b, and then you take that quantity squared, what that turns out to be, let's actually do this. So a plus b times a plus b, you get a squared plus a times b plus a times b plus b squared. And so you get a squared plus 2ab plus b squared. Now it doesn't look like a shortcut, but this is actually a shortcut. What this means is that whatever your first term is, you square it. That's where you get a squared from. Here, let me do this in a different color. Whatever your first term is, you square it. That's your first answer, or first part of your answer. Whatever your second term is, a positive b, you square it. B squared. And then to find your middle term, you have to take your a times the b and multiply that by 2. Okay? Let's go back to this number 1 example and kind of use this shortcut formula just so that you can see. Okay? Now, according to the formula, this shortcut, what it's saying is my answer, without having to do all this FOIL work, my answer will be, I take my first term and I square it, a squared. So, I have x squared, my first term squared, that's my first thing, and then there's going to be some middle here, but I'm going to take my last thing and do 3 squared, which is plus 9, 3 squared. Okay? Now, to find the middle term, it says I have to multiply 2 times a times b. 2 times x times 3, 2 times x times 3 gives me 6x. And that's actually the same answer that we got from before when we just did a normal FOIL. So really this is a shortcut, okay? Now, I'm going to give you just a little bit of a, I'm going to give you a little bit of a suggestion. If you don't understand this shortcut, fine. I'm okay with that, okay? Then just use normal FOIL. If you understand the shortcut, then great. Then you kind of benefit from it, okay? Section 4 is not anything really new. It's just, can you find these shortcuts, all right? So what I want you to do is, for the last 2 examples, this example where it's kind of the same thing, only you're subtracting in the middle, there's a rule for that. I want you to use FOIL for numbers 4, 5, and 6, and then see if you could find the rule, okay? So you try to figure out what the rule is. Again, if you can't, it's fine, as long as you're fine with the FOIL. And then I want you to go to the last page, where you have another special product, where one of them is an addition and the other one is a subtraction, and use FOIL again, and I want you to see again if you can figure out what is the shortcut instead of having to use FOIL. But again, if you don't understand, then just use FOIL, okay? So that's kind of your homework in addition to the worksheet that I gave you that's going to be due when you come back to class. Alright, so Try sections 3 and section 4. If you have any questions, feel free to message me, email me, contact me somehow, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can.